In the spring of 1945, General George S. Patton stood in front of a map of Europe and said something that nobody in that room was prepared to hear. He said that the United States Army had just defeated the wrong enemy, and that they needed to turn around, rearm the Germans, and march straight into Russia before it was too late. And the men standing around him went completely silent because they knew he wasn't joking. He never joked about things like that. And what made that moment even more explosive was the fact that Patton had just received a series of detailed reports about what was happening to German civilians in the Soviet-occupied zones. Reports so disturbing that even hardened military officers who had spent years on the front lines couldn't read them without putting them down halfway through, and Patton read every single page. By the time the war in Europe was winding down, most American generals were focused on logistics, on occupation policy, on getting their men home, on the politics of the new post-war world order that was already taking shape around them. But Patton was doing something completely different. He was driving through the towns and villages of Bavaria in his staff car, talking to refugees, listening to priests and doctors and ordinary people who had survived the Soviet advance. And what they told him was building into something inside him that his staff described as barely contained fury, the kind of fury that Patton usually reserved for enemy commanders who underestimated him. Except this time, it was directed at the people who were supposed to be on the same side. The reports that were landing on his desk in the spring and summer of 1945 painted a picture that the official Allied narrative was doing everything possible to avoid acknowledging, because acknowledging it would have complicated the entire story of the war, the story of the good guys versus the bad guys, the story that had been sold to the American public for years, and the reality on the ground in Eastern Germany was that hundreds of thousands of German women were being systematically brutalized by Soviet soldiers, not as isolated incidents or the acts of rogue individuals, but as something that was happening on a massive, organized, almost industrial scale, and the Soviet command was either unable or entirely unwilling to stop it. Patton had a complicated relationship with the truth, in the sense that he always preferred it over comfortable lies, even when the truth was something that powerful people desperately wanted buried. And the truth in this case was that the Soviet army that had just helped defeat Nazi Germany was now terrorizing the very civilian population that the Allies were supposedly liberating. And Patton couldn't look at that and pretend it wasn't happening, the same way he couldn't look at a poorly executed military maneuver and pretend it was fine. It simply wasn't in his character, and that character was about to put him on a collision course with some of the most powerful men in the world. What made Patton's response so shocking to the Allied command wasn't just what he said. It was the chain of actions he took that nobody had authorized and nobody had expected, because Patton didn't just write angry diary entries about the situation. He actually started doing something about it, and what he did flew directly in the face of the official occupation policy that had been handed down from Washington and from Eisenhower's headquarters, and it revealed a fundamental disagreement about what the war had actually been fought for. A disagreement that Patton was not willing to quietly swallow just because the people above him outranked him. The occupation zones of Germany in 1945 were supposed to be clearly divided and clearly administered, with each Allied power controlling its own sector and American forces maintaining strict non-interference in what happened inside the Soviet zone. And there were very specific and very firm orders from the highest levels of Allied command that American soldiers were not to cross into Soviet-controlled territory without explicit authorization, because the political relationship between Washington and Moscow was already delicate enough without American generals freelancing on the ground, and Patton received those orders, read them, understood them completely, and then proceeded to do almost exactly what they told him not to do, because to Patton, a direct order that conflicted with basic human decency existed in a category that required serious examination before automatic compliance. There was a particular incident that brought everything to a head, and it involved a group of refugees who had managed to escape across the demarcation line into the American zone. Refugees who brought with them accounts of what was happening in the towns and villages they had left behind, accounts that aligned precisely with everything that was already sitting in the intelligence files on Patton's desk. And after meeting with some of these people directly, Patton went back to his headquarters and wrote a letter to Eisenhower that was so direct and so unambiguous in its language that the officers who read it before it went up the chain described it as essentially career-ending material, because Patton wasn't asking for a policy review or gently suggesting that perhaps the situation deserved attention. He was telling the Supreme Allied Commander that what was happening in the Soviet zone was a disgrace, that the Allied silence on the matter was complicity, and that he intended to make the protection of German civilians a priority in his own zone, regardless of what the official policy said. Eisenhower's response to that letter was not warmth and agreement, and the relationship between the two men, which had always been complicated, built on mutual respect that was constantly undermined by Patton's inability to operate within political constraints, got significantly colder because Eisenhower was operating in a world where Soviet-American relations had to be carefully managed, where Stalin was a partner who needed to be kept reasonably satisfied, where the political architecture of the post-war world was being constructed in real time and couldn't be disrupted by a general who thought that moral clarity should override diplomatic necessity. And from Eisenhower's perspective, Patton was a military genius who had become a political catastrophe, who kept threatening to blow up everything that had been carefully built. But here's what's fascinating about Patton's position, and what the official history tends to skip over very quickly, because it's inconvenient. He wasn't wrong about what was happening. The reports were accurate. The scale of the atrocities in the Soviet zone was real. Historians decades later would confirm everything that Patton was saying in 1945. And the estimates of German women who were subjected to sexual violence by Soviet soldiers during and after the war range from hundreds of thousands to over 1 million. Numbers that are almost impossible to process. Numbers that represent an almost unimaginable human catastrophe that was happening simultaneously with the official Allied victory celebrations. And Patton was one of the very few people in a position of authority who was willing to call it what it was. What Patton actually did in his own zone of occupation was something that his superiors found deeply embarrassing and politically inconvenient, because he started treating German civilians, including former Nazis and their families, with a level of basic protection and humanitarian consideration that directly contradicted the official denazification policy, which held that ordinary Germans needed to be made to understand their collective guilt and their collective responsibility for what the Nazi regime had done. And Patton thought that policy was not only cruel, but strategically idiotic, because he believed that if you wanted a stable Germany that wouldn't eventually produce another catastrophic war, you needed to give people something to live for rather than grinding them into the dirt, while simultaneously handing their country over to a Soviet system that he had come to regard as at least as dangerous as the one that had just been defeated. The diary entries that Patton was writing during this period are remarkable documents, and they've been available to historians for decades, but they tend to make people uncomfortable because they reveal a man who was thinking several steps ahead of almost everyone around him and arriving at conclusions that were politically unacceptable but turned out to be historically prescient, because Patton was writing in 1945 about the coming confrontation with the Soviet Union that most American policymakers were still trying to pretend wouldn't happen. And he was writing about the moral cost of turning a blind eye to Soviet behavior in occupied Europe, in terms that anticipated arguments that historians and political theorists would spend the next 70 years working through. And he was writing all of this while simultaneously running one of the most complex military occupation administrations in history. The confrontation between Patton and his superiors over the treatment of German civilians came to a particularly sharp point during a press conference in September of 1945, when Patton said something that was simultaneously true, deeply impolitic, and strategically catastrophic for his own career. He compared the Nazi Party to the Democratic and Republican parties back home, in the sense that most ordinary party members had joined for practical reasons rather than ideological conviction, and he said that using former Nazi administrators to run the occupation was no different from using experienced Democrats or Republicans to run a government after an election. And the press corps erupted, and the headlines the next morning were exactly as bad as his staff had been dreading. And Eisenhower used that press conference as the final justification for removing Patton from command of the Third Army, the army he had built from nothing into one of the most effective fighting forces in the history of warfare. What happened next is where the story gets genuinely strange, because Patton was reassigned to a paper command, the 15th Army, which existed largely to write the official history of the European campaign, which was almost insultingly symbolic, given who Patton was and what he had done. And Patton was furious, and he was increasingly open about his fury in conversations with his staff and in his diary, and he was making plans to return to the United States and essentially go public with everything he believed about the Soviet threat, about the occupation policy, about what he had witnessed in Germany, and he had the kind of celebrity and credibility that would have made those arguments extremely difficult for the political establishment to ignore. And then in December of 1945, he was involved in a low-speed car accident outside Mannheim that should not have been life-threatening, and within 2 weeks, he was dead. The official cause of death was an embolism following a cervical spinal injury from the accident, and the accident itself was ruled unremarkable, a collision between his staff car and an army truck on a country road, and most historians accept that account as straightforward. But what lingers around the edges of the story, and what has kept conspiracy theorists busy for decades, is the timing, because Patton died precisely when he was most vocal, most politically dangerous, and most determined to say publicly what he had been saying privately for months. And whether you believe the accident was exactly what it appeared to be, or something more deliberate, the result was the same. The most inconvenient general in the American army was gone, and the things he had been saying about the Soviet Union and about the moral compromises of the Allied occupation were buried under the weight of the official victory narrative for years. The story of what Patton found out about the Soviet soldiers and what he chose to do about it is ultimately a story about the gap between the war that gets remembered and the war that actually happened, because the version that gets taught in schools and celebrated in movies is clean and simple. Good defeated evil, the Allies liberated Europe, and democracy won, and that's not entirely wrong. Evil was genuinely defeated, and the outcome was genuinely better than the alternative. But the actual texture of 1945 was far messier and far darker than the official story admits, and Patton was one of the people who saw that messiness up close and refused to pretend otherwise. And that refusal is what made him simultaneously the most authentic figure of the entire Allied command and the most impossible one to manage. And maybe that's why his story keeps pulling people back, because there's something in the human imagination that responds to the person who looks at a convenient lie and decides it isn't good enough, even when the cost of that decision turns out to be everything.